Jake Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair as he tried to find a position that didn't make his back ache. The furniture at Galactic Academy was designed for beings much smaller and lighter than humans. His legs were too long for the seat, and his shoulders were too broad for the backrest. He had been dealing with this problem for 3 months now, ever since he arrived on Xerion Prime as part of Earth's first student exchange program. The classroom buzzed with quiet conversations in a dozen different languages. Jake understood, most of them thanks to the universal translator implanted behind his ear, but he still felt like an outsider. His classmates were unlike anything he had ever seen back on Earth. They came from worlds so different from his home planet that sometimes Jake wondered how they all managed to breathe the same air. To his left sat Zixtal, whose body looked like it was carved from living crystal. The Vorthon's skin reflected the classroom lights in rainbow patterns, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Zixtal came from a world where silicon-based life had evolved, instead of carbon-based creatures like humans. His people lived for thousands of years and thought very slowly about everything they did. On Jake's right was Mirlin, an aquatic being from the ocean world called Depths. Her skin was pale blue and slightly wet, and she had to wear a special breathing apparatus that kept her gills moist. Delicate fins ran along her arms and legs, and her large eyes were adapted for seeing in the dark depths of her homeworld's oceans. She moved with a flowing grace that reminded Jake of dancers, but she was also very fragile compared to humans. Behind them sat Quindar, an insect-like creature from Nexus 7th. His compound eyes could see in directions that hurt Jake's brain to think about, and his forearms moved independently as he took notes on multiple data pads at once. Quindar belonged to a hive mind, which meant he could share thoughts with others of his kind, but being so far from home left him feeling isolated and confused. These three had become Jake's closest friends at the academy, though friendship was a concept that worked differently for each of their species. They were curious about him in the same way he was curious about them, but Jake had noticed something strange. While he found their differences interesting and exciting, they seemed almost afraid of him sometimes. He had overheard them talking when they thought he couldn't understand their native languages. They called him a deathworlder and whispered about how dangerous his home planet must be. Jake didn't understand why they thought Earth was so dangerous. Sure, there were some animals that could hurt people, and the weather could be rough sometimes, but it was just home to him. The classroom door slid open with a soft hiss and Professor Veltar entered. The old reptilian academic was one of the most respected xenobiology teachers in the galaxy. His scales were a deep green color that had faded to gray around his eyes and mouth, showing his advanced age. He moved slowly but with purpose, his tail dragging slightly behind him as he walked to the front of the classroom. "Good morning, students," Professor Veltar said, his voice carrying the slight hiss that was common to his species. "Today we will be conducting a very special lesson. Instead of simply reading about apex predators from various worlds, we will observe one in person." An excited murmur ran through the classroom. Jake noticed that while his classmates sounded interested, there was also a note of nervousness in their voices. Even Quindar's 4 arms had stopped moving, which was unusual for the normally hyperactive insectoid. Professor Veltar continued, "The specimen we will be studying today comes from the jungle moon of Kithara. It is considered one of the most dangerous predators in our known galaxy, and as such we will be taking extensive safety precautions." Jake watched as several technicians entered the classroom, carrying equipment he had never seen before. They began setting up what looked like multiple layers of energy barriers around a circular pit in the center of the room. The barriers hummed with power, and Jake could feel the static electricity making the hair on his arms stand up. "The creature we will observe is called a shadow stalker," the professor explained as the technicians worked. "It is roughly the size of what you humans might call a large dog, Jake, but do not let its size fool you. The shadow stalker possesses several abilities that make it extraordinarily dangerous." Zixtal raised one of his crystalline hands. "Professor, how dangerous are we talking about?" "My homeworld's most feared predator is the crystal spider, and it only hunts creatures smaller than itself." "An excellent question," Professor Veltar replied. "The shadow stalker has been known to successfully hunt prey up to 3 times its own size. It possesses razor-sharp retractable claws, can move faster than most beings can track with their eyes, and has the ability to partially phase out of the visible spectrum. Mirlin made a sound that her translator rendered as a worried gasp. It can become invisible? Not completely invisible, but very difficult to see, the professor confirmed. This is why we have multiple detection systems in place. The creature also has multiple eyes that can see in spectrums most of us cannot, giving it a significant advantage when hunting. Jake found himself genuinely interested now. The Shadow Stalker sounded like a fascinating creature, and he was curious to see how it compared to Earth's predators. He had grown up in Montana, where his family's ranch was home to mountain lions, bears, and wolves. His grandfather had taught him about animal behavior from a young age, explaining how to read body language and understand what different creatures were thinking. The technicians finished their setup and stepped back. Professor Veltar checked several monitors before nodding his approval. The containment field is now active. As an additional safety measure, I want all students to remain in their seats throughout the demonstration. The barriers are designed to contain the creature, but we must not take any unnecessary risks. Jake noticed that his classmates had moved their chairs slightly further back from the demonstration area. Zixtal's crystalline skin had taken on a slightly darker hue, which Jake had learned meant the Vorthon was feeling stressed. Mirlin was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and Quindar's compound eyes were darting nervously around the room. "Are you not concerned, Jake?" Zixtal asked quietly. "This creature sounds incredibly dangerous." Jake shrugged. "I'm curious to see it. It sounds like an interesting animal." His three friends exchanged glances. Mirlin leaned closer to him. "Do you not understand? This creature could kill any of us in seconds if the barriers failed." "The barriers won't fail," Jake said reasonably. "And besides, it's just an animal. Animals are predictable if you know how to read them." Quindar's antennae twitched nervously. "Just an animal? Jake, this is an apex predator from one of the most dangerous worlds in the galaxy. How can you be so calm?" Jake didn't know how to explain that the Shadow Stalker didn't sound particularly scary to him. He had been charged by an angry bull elk during hunting season and had faced down a protective mother bear who had wandered too close to his family's property. Those experiences had taught him that most animals, no matter how dangerous they seemed, were just trying to survive and protect themselves. Professor Veltar activated a control panel, and a section of the floor began to rise, revealing a transport container. "The Shadow Stalker has been sedated for transport, but the effects will wear off shortly. Please observe quietly as we begin our demonstration." The container opened with a mechanical hiss, and Jake leaned forward slightly to get a better look at the creature that had his classmates so frightened. The Shadow Stalker emerged from its transport container slowly, still groggy from the sedation. Jake watched with interest as the creature stretched and looked around the classroom. It was about the size of a German shepherd, with sleek black fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its body was lean and muscular, built for speed and agility rather than brute strength. What struck Jake most were the creature's eyes. It had 6 of them, arranged in pairs along the sides and top of its head. Each eye was a different size, and Jake guessed they probably saw different types of light. The largest pair glowed with a soft yellow light, while the smaller ones seemed to shift color as they moved. The Shadow Stalker's claws were currently retracted, but Jake could see the sheaths where they would emerge from its paws. Its tail was long and flexible, twitching as the creature tested the air with what appeared to be scent organs along its length. Overall, Jake thought it looked like a very well-designed predator, but nothing that seemed impossibly dangerous. His classmates, however, were having very different reactions. Mirlin had stopped breathing through her gills and was using her emergency air supply, a sure sign that she was terrified. The aquatic being's pale blue skin had turned almost white, and her large eyes were fixed on the Shadow Stalker with absolute focus. Zixtal's crystalline body was making soft chiming sounds as stress fractures appeared and disappeared in his skin. The Vorthon's usual rainbow reflections had dulled to a muddy brown color. His people expressed fear through changes in their crystal structure, and right now Zixtal looked like he might shatter completely. Quindar was the most obvious in his terror. All 4 of his arms were trembling, and his compound eyes were dilated so wide that Jake could see his reflection dozens of times in each one. The insectoid was making small chittering sounds that his translator couldn't process, probably because they were sounds of pure panic rather than actual words. Professor Veltar seemed pleased with his students' reactions. As you can see, the shadow stalker is now fully awake. Notice how it immediately begins to assess its environment. This is typical behavior for apex predators when they find themselves in unfamiliar territory. The creature had indeed begun moving around the containment area, sniffing at the energy barriers and testing them with gentle paw touches. It moved with fluid grace, each step perfectly placed and silent. Jake could see why it was called a shadow stalker. Even in the bright classroom lighting, the creature seemed to blend with the darker areas of its enclosure. "Now watch carefully," Professor Veltar said as he activated a holographic projector. "I will demonstrate the shadow stalker's hunting behavior using simulated prey." A holographic image of a small rabbit-like creature appeared in the containment area. It was about the size of a house cat and moved in quick, nervous hops. The moment it appeared, the shadow stalker's entire demeanor changed. Its 6 eyes locked onto the hologram, and its body dropped into a hunting crouch. Jake found himself impressed by the creature's focus. It reminded him of watching his family's barn cats when they spotted a mouse. The shadow stalker began to stalk the holographic prey with incredible patience, moving so slowly that it seemed almost motionless. "Observe the patience," Professor Veltar narrated. "A shadow stalker can maintain this hunting posture for hours if necessary. They are ambush predators, preferring to wait for the perfect moment rather than waste energy on a chase they might lose." The holographic prey hopped closer to where the shadow stalker was hiding. Jake could see the creature's muscles tensing, preparing for a strike. Even knowing it was coming, the speed of the attack surprised him. The shadow stalker moved faster than his eyes could follow, covering the distance to its prey in what seemed like an instant. Of course, the hologram wasn't real, so the creature's claws passed right through it. But Jake could see that if the prey had been real, it would have been killed instantly. The shadow stalker's claws had extended to their full length during the attack, revealing curved talons that were easily 3 inches long. "Incredible," breathed Zixtal, though his voice shook with fear. "On my world, even our fastest predators cannot move that quickly." The shadow stalker's reflexes are enhanced by its multiple visual systems, Professor Veltar explained. Each pair of eyes sees different wavelengths of light, giving it a complete picture of its environment that most beings cannot match. Mirlin raised a trembling hand. "Professor, how do creatures on Cathara survive with such perfect predators hunting them?" "An excellent question," the professor replied. "Most prey species on Cathara have evolved extreme caution and powerful group defense mechanisms. They rarely venture out alone, and they have developed calls that can alert entire herds to danger from miles away." Jake listened to this explanation with growing interest. It sounded like Cathara had an ecosystem where prey and predators had evolved together, each becoming more sophisticated in response to the other. It was similar to what happened on Earth, where deer had become incredibly alert and fast because they were hunted by wolves and mountain lions. Professor Veltar activated another control, and the hologram changed to show a different type of prey. This one was larger, about the size of a small deer, with long legs built for running. Now we will see how the shadow stalker adapts its hunting strategy for different types of prey. The shadow stalker studied the new hologram for several minutes. Jake could almost see it thinking, analyzing this new challenge. Finally, it began to move, but this time its approach was completely different. Instead of the slow stalk it had used before, the creature began to circle the hologram, staying just outside of what would be the prey's vision range. "Notice the change in tactics," Professor Veltar pointed out. "The shadow stalker recognizes that this prey is built for speed and has good vision, so instead of relying on stealth alone, it is positioning itself to attack from the prey's blind spot." As they watched, the shadow stalker began to use its special ability. Parts of its body started to fade from view, becoming translucent and hard to see. It wasn't completely invisible, but it blended so well with the shadows that Jake had to concentrate to keep track of where it was. This is the ability that gives the shadow stalker its name, Professor Veltar said. It can partially shift its body out of the normal visible spectrum. The effect is not perfect, but combined with its natural camouflage, it makes the creature extremely difficult to detect. Quindar made a sound that was part whimper and part chittering. How is any creature supposed to defend against that? It is like fighting a ghost. Prey animals on Cathera have developed enhanced hearing and smell to compensate, the professor explained. They also travel in large groups and post sentries. But you are correct that the Shadow Stalker's abilities make it one of the most successful predators in the known galaxy. Jake watched the creature complete its attack on the second hologram. Again, the speed was impressive, but what really caught his attention was the intelligence behind the hunt. The Shadow Stalker had analyzed its prey, adapted its strategy, and executed a perfect attack. It wasn't just a killing machine, it was a thinking, adapting hunter. Now I will demonstrate what happens when a Shadow Stalker encounters multiple prey items, Professor Veltar announced. 3 holographic creatures appeared in the containment area, all of different sizes and types. Jake leaned forward, curious to see how the predator would handle this more complex situation. Around him, his classmates were gripping their chairs and making sounds of distress, but Jake found the demonstration fascinating. The Shadow Stalker paused, clearly considering its options. Its 6 eyes moved independently, tracking all 3 potential prey items at once. After a long moment, it began to move toward the smallest and weakest looking of the 3 holograms. Smart, Jake murmured to himself, not realizing he had spoken aloud. Sixtal turned to stare at him. Smart? Jake, this creature is demonstrating how it would kill us all if given the chance. How can you call it smart? Jake looked at his crystalline friend in surprise. Well, it is smart. Look how it analyzed the situation and picked the easiest target. That's exactly what any good hunter would do. It's not going to waste energy on a difficult kill when there's an easier option available. The 3 aliens stared at Jake with expressions that ranged from shock to horror. Mirlin's gills fluttered rapidly as she tried to process what he had just said. Jake, you sound like you admire this creature. I do, Jake said honestly. It's a magnificent predator. Look at how perfectly it's adapted to its environment and hunting style. You have to respect that kind of evolutionary success. Quindar's compound eyes seemed to bulge even more than usual. Respect it? Jake, that thing would eat us without a second thought. How can you respect something that wants to kill you? Jake shrugged. Lots of things want to kill you. That doesn't mean they're evil or that you can't appreciate how good they are at what they do. A Shadow Stalker is just trying to survive, same as anything else. His 3 friends exchanged looks that Jake was beginning to recognize. It was the same expression they got whenever he mentioned something about Earth that they found incomprehensible. They were starting to understand that their human classmate came from a very different kind of world than they did. The demonstration was going smoothly when the first alarm started ringing. It was a soft chime at first, the kind that usually meant someone had left a door open or forgotten to log out of a computer. Professor Veltar glanced at his control panel with mild concern but continued his lecture about the Shadow Stalker's hunting patterns. The Shadow Stalker itself seemed unbothered by the sound. It was still focused on the holographic prey, moving through another hunting sequence with deadly precision. Jake watched as the creature demonstrated its ability to leap incredible distances, covering nearly 15 feet in a single bound to reach its target. As you can see, Professor Veltar was saying, the Shadow Stalker's leg muscles are incredibly powerful, allowing it to... The soft chime suddenly became a loud, urgent wailing that filled the entire classroom. Red lights began flashing along the walls, and Jake could hear similar alarms going off in other parts of the building. The emergency lighting system activated, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made the Shadow Stalker's dark fur look even more menacing. Professor Veltar's calm demeanor changed instantly. His reptilian features tightened with worry as he rushed to his control panel, his clawed fingers dancing over the controls. "This is a power grid failure," he announced, his voice tense. "Please remain calm while I secure the containment systems." Jake felt his heart rate increase slightly, but not from panic. Years of living on a ranch had taught him that emergencies required clear thinking, not fear. He looked around the classroom, assessing the situation. The energy barriers around the Shadow Stalker's enclosure were flickering slightly, but they still seemed stable. His classmates were not handling the situation as well. Zixtal's crystalline body had begun to fracture, visibly stress lines running through his structure like cracks in ice. The Vorthen's people had evolved on a world with no natural disasters, so any kind of emergency was deeply traumatic for them. Mirlin had activated her emergency breathing apparatus and was making high-pitched whistling sounds that Jake had never heard before. Her pale blue skin was now almost transparent, and her large eyes were darting around the room as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. Quindar was perhaps in the worst state of all. The insectoid's 4 arms were moving frantically, pressing buttons on his communication device in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to contact his hive mind back home. But they were too far away, and the connection had been lost. Without the constant mental link to his people, Quindar was experiencing something like sensory deprivation, and the emergency was making it much worse. Professor Veltar's efforts at the control panel were becoming more frantic. "The backup power systems are not responding properly," he muttered, more to himself than to the students. "The surge must have damaged more than just the main grid." Jake stood up slowly, his movement calm and deliberate despite the chaos around him. "Professor, is there anything I can do to help?" The old reptilian looked at him with surprise. "Jake, please return to your seat. The situation is under control." But even as he said it, the containment field around the Shadow Stalker flickered, more violently. Sparks began to fly from the projector units, and the humming sound that had filled the room since the demonstration began started to change pitch, becoming higher and more unstable. The Shadow Stalker had noticed the changes too. The creature stopped its hunting display and began pacing around the edge of its enclosure, testing the barriers with its paws. Its 6 eyes were all focused outward now, studying the room beyond its prison with obvious interest. "The containment field is failing," Professor Veltar announced, his voice barely audible over the alarms. "I need to activate the emergency lockdown protocols." He pressed a series of buttons on his panel, but nothing happened. The red lights continued flashing, the alarms continued wailing, and the containment field continued to weaken. Professor Veltar tried the sequence again, his movements becoming more desperate with each failed attempt. "The lockdown system is not responding," he said, and for the first time since Jake had known him, the professor sounded truly frightened. "The power surge has damaged the emergency systems as well." The Shadow Stalker was becoming more agitated by the minute. It could sense that something was wrong with its containment, and its predator instincts were telling it to find a way out. The creature began throwing itself against the weakening energy barriers, testing their strength with increasing boldness. Jake's classmates were starting to panic completely. Zixtal made a sound like breaking glass as more stress fractures appeared in his crystalline form. "We are all going to die," he whispered, his voice harmonizing strangely as it passed through his cracked structure. Mirlin had curled herself into a tight ball, her fins pressed against her body in a defensive posture that her people used when faced with the massive predators of their ocean depths. She was making continuous whistling sounds now, a distress call that would have brought help from miles away on her homeworld. But here, in this alien classroom, there was no one to hear her cry for help. Quindar had gone completely silent, which was somehow more disturbing than his earlier chittering. The insectoid was standing perfectly still, all 4 arms hanging at his sides, his compound eyes staring blankly at nothing. Jake realized that Quindar was going into some kind of shock, overwhelmed by the combination of isolation from his hive mind and the immediate danger. Professor Veltar was now openly panicking, pressing random buttons on his control panel in a desperate attempt to find something that still worked. "The communication systems are down," he announced. "I cannot call for help. The emergency barriers will not activate. The containment field is at 15% power and falling." Jake looked at the Shadow Stalker and saw that the creature had stopped throwing itself against the barriers. Instead, It was studying the weak points in the energy field with the patient intelligence of a natural problem solver. The predator had realized that brute force wouldn't work, so it was looking for a more subtle approach. "Professor," Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him, "how long do you think the containment field will hold?" Professor Veltar looked at his instruments with shaking hands. "At the current rate of power loss, perhaps 5 minutes. Maybe less if the creature continues to test the barriers." As if summoned by his words, the Shadowstalker found what it was looking for. There was a spot near the base of the containment area where the energy field was slightly weaker than the rest. The creature pressed its paw against that spot and held it there, as if it could sense the difference in power levels. The energy barrier flickered more violently where the Shadowstalker was touching it. Sparks flew from the projector units, and the humming sound became a grinding whine that hurt Jake's ears. The creature pulled its paw back and examined the spot where it had been touching. Then, with deliberate precision, it extended a single claw and pressed it against the exact same location. The barrier sparked and flickered, and for just a moment, the Shadowstalker's claw passed through the energy field. The creature pulled back immediately, but Jake could see the satisfaction in its 6 eyes. It had found the weak point and now it knew exactly how to exploit it. "It's learning," Jake said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Professor Veltar heard him anyway. "What did you say?" "The Shadowstalker," Jake explained, his voice still calm despite everything happening around them. "It's not just trying to break out randomly. It's studying the containment field, learning how it works, finding its weaknesses. That's not just animal intelligence. That's problem solving." The professor stared at Jake as if he had grown a second head. "How can you be so calm? Do you not understand what will happen if that creature escapes?" Jake looked around the classroom at his terrified classmates and his panicking professor. He looked at the sparking control panels and the failing containment field. He looked at the Shadowstalker, now methodically testing different spots along the energy barrier with scientific precision. "Yeah," he said simply. "I understand." The containment field gave another violent flicker, and this time it stayed dark for almost a full second before coming back online. When it did, it was noticeably weaker than before. The Shadowstalker's eyes all turned toward the area where the field had failed, and Jake could see the creature calculating its next move. The alarms continued to wail, the red lights continued to flash, and somewhere in the distance Jake could hear other emergency systems failing throughout the academy. Whatever had caused the initial power surge had done more damage than anyone had realized. Professor Veltar made one last desperate attempt to restore power to the emergency systems, but it was no use. The containment field was now fluctuating, wildly, sometimes strong enough to contain the Shadowstalker, and sometimes barely visible at all. The creature sensed its opportunity and began to move toward the weakest section of the barrier. Its movements were no longer the patient stalking of a hunter, but the purposeful advance of an intelligent being that had solved a complex problem and was ready to act on its solution. Jake stood up completely now, ignoring Professor Veltar's renewed pleas for him to stay seated. The Shadowstalker stepped out of its containment area with careful, deliberate movements. Its 6 eyes swept across the classroom, taking in every detail of its new environment. The creature's head turned from side to side as it analyzed the panicked aliens before it, clearly trying to decide which one would make the easiest prey. Professor Veltar had backed against the far wall, his reptilian body pressed flat against the surface as if he could somehow merge with it and disappear. His control panel was sparking and useless, and his hand shook as he fumbled for his emergency communicator. The device beeped weakly but produced no signal. Zixtal had completely frozen in place. The Vorthan's crystalline body was covered with stress fractures that made him look like a statue that had been hit with a hammer. His rainbow colors had faded to a dull gray, and he was making soft chiming sounds that seemed to happen involuntarily whenever he tried to breathe. Quindar remained, motionless in his shock-induced trance. The insectoid's compound eyes stared at nothing, and his forearms hung limp at his sides. Without his connection to the hive mind, and faced with a crisis beyond anything his peaceful species had ever evolved to handle, his mind had simply shut down to protect itself. But it was Mirlin who caught the Shadowstalker's attention first. The aquatic being was still curled in a defensive ball, but her distress whistles were getting louder and more frequent. On her homeworld, these sounds would have warned other creatures to stay away from danger. Here, they were doing the exact opposite. The Shadowstalker's largest pair of eyes focused on Mirlin, and its body dropped into the hunting crouch Jake had seen during the demonstration. The creature began to move toward her with the same patient stalking behavior it had shown with the holograms, except this time its prey was real and terrified. Jake watched this happening and felt something shift inside his mind. It wasn't panic or fear like his classmates were experiencing. Instead, it was a calm, focused awareness that he recognized from hunting trips with his grandfather back in Montana. His senses seemed to sharpen, his thinking became clearer, and his body prepared itself for action without any conscious decision on his part. The Shadowstalker was now within 10 feet of Mirlin, moving so slowly that it was almost invisible. Its claws had extended slightly, and Jake could see the muscles in its legs bunching for a strike. In another few seconds, it would be close enough to attack. Jake stood up from his chair and took a single step forward. The movement was quiet and controlled, but the Shadowstalker noticed it immediately. All 6 of its eyes turned toward Jake, and its body language changed completely. The relaxed confidence of a predator approaching easy prey was replaced by the alert tension of an animal that had just noticed a potential threat. Jake took another step forward, this time deliberately making a little more noise. His grandfather had taught him that when dealing with predators, you needed to make your intentions clear. Running away would trigger a chase response, but acting like prey would get you killed. The key was to act like something that wasn't prey at all. "Jake, what are you doing?" Professor Veltar whispered from his position against the wall. "Get back to your seat immediately." Jake ignored the professor and took another step toward the Shadowstalker. The creature was now fully focused on him, its head tilted slightly, as it tried to figure out what this strange new threat might be. Jake could see confusion in its multiple eyes. This wasn't how prey was supposed to behave. "Jake, please," Mirlin whimpered from her defensive curl. "Do not make it angry. Maybe if we all stay very still, it will leave us alone." But Jake knew that wasn't how predators worked. The Shadowstalker wasn't going to leave them alone. It was a hunting animal in a confined space with multiple potential prey items. Eventually, it would attack one of them, and his classmates had no idea how to defend themselves. He took another step forward, and this time he made direct eye contact with the Shadowstalker's primary eyes. On Earth, staring down a predator was sometimes the difference between being seen as prey and being seen as a rival. Jake had used this technique with aggressive dogs, angry bulls, and even a mountain lion that had wandered onto his family's property. The Shadowstalker's response was immediate and dramatic. It pulled back from Mirlin and turned to face Jake directly, its body language shifting from hunting mode to defensive mode. The creature hissed softly, a sound that made Jake's classmates whimper with terror. But Jake heard something different in it. The hiss wasn't aggressive, it was nervous. Jake straightened to his full height and spread his arms slightly, making himself appear larger. This was another technique his grandfather had taught him. Most predators preferred to avoid fights with anything that might hurt them. If you could convince them that you were bigger and stronger than they would usually look for easier targets. The Shadowstalker took a step backward. Jake felt a surge of satisfaction but didn't let it show on his face. The creature was responding exactly the way he had hoped it would. Now he needed to maintain the pressure without triggering an attack. He took another slow, deliberate step forward. "Stop moving," Professor Veltar hissed urgently. "You are making it more aggressive." But Jake could see that the professor was wrong. The Shadowstalker wasn't becoming more aggressive. It was becoming more cautious. The creature was reassessing the situation, trying to figure out if this strange new threat was worth fighting, or if it would be better to find a different target. Jake decided to help it make that decision. He took a deep breath and spoke in a low, steady voice. "Easy there, nobody wants to fight you, but you need to back away from my friends." He didn't expect the Shadowstalker to understand his words, but tone of voice was something that most animals could interpret. Jake kept his voice calm and confident, the same way he would talk to a nervous horse or an aggressive dog. He was communicating that he wasn't afraid, but he also wasn't trying to hurt the creature. The shadow stalker tilted its head again, clearly puzzled by Jake's behavior. On its home world, prey either ran away or froze in terror. Rivals fought, or displayed aggressively. But Jake was doing something different. He was asserting dominance without being threatening, claiming territory without being aggressive. Jake took another step forward, and this time the shadow stalker took 2 steps back. The creature was definitely retreating now, but it was doing so while maintaining eye contact with Jake, which meant it was treating him as an equal rather than as prey. "That's right," Jake said quietly. "Just back up a little. Nobody needs to get hurt here." Behind him, Jake could hear his classmates making sounds of amazement and terror. Zixtal was chiming more loudly, but the stress fractures in his crystalline body had stopped spreading. Mirlin had uncurled slightly and was watching the confrontation with her large eyes wide with disbelief. Professor Veltar was the most vocal in his shock. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No being can face a shadow stalker without weapons or barriers. It should have attacked by now." But Jake understood something that the professor and his classmates didn't. The shadow stalker wasn't a mindless killing machine. It was an intelligent predator that had evolved on a world where survival meant making smart decisions about when to fight and when to retreat. Right now it was choosing to retreat because Jake was presenting himself as something that might be dangerous to fight. The creature continued to back away, its 6 eyes never leaving Jake's face. It was moving toward the far corner of the classroom, away from the huddled aliens and away from the obvious exits. Jake realized it was looking for a place where it could defend itself if necessary, but also a place where it wouldn't be trapped. Jake stopped moving forward and held his position. He had established dominance and created distance between the predator and his classmates. Now he needed to give the shadow stalker some space so it wouldn't feel cornered. A cornered predator was a dangerous predator, even one that had already acknowledged your superiority. "Good," he said softly. "That's far enough. You can stay there." The shadow stalker seemed to understand that Jake had stopped advancing. It settled into a watchful crouch in the corner, its body language still alert but no longer actively threatening. All 6 eyes remained focused on Jake, but the tension in its muscles had relaxed slightly. Jake turned slightly to check on his classmates without taking his eyes completely off the shadow stalker. Mirlin was sitting up now, her gills fluttering, with rapid breathing but her color returning to normal. Zixtal's stress fractures were healing, and his crystalline body was starting to show faint rainbow colors again. Quindar was still in his trance, but Jake could see that the insectoid's eyes were starting to track movement again. The immediate crisis seemed to be bringing him back to awareness, even without his hive mind connection. "Professor," Jake said without turning around, "how long until emergency services arrive?" Professor Veltar checked his instruments with shaking hands. The automated distress beacon should have activated when the power failed. Help should arrive within 30 minutes. Jake nodded. 30 minutes was a long time to maintain a standoff with a shadow stalker, but it was manageable. The key would be to keep the creature calm and contained without letting it feel trapped or threatened. The standoff continued for what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes. Jake maintained his position in the center of the classroom while the shadow stalker watched him from its corner. Neither moved aggressively, but both remained, alert and ready to react to any change in the situation. Jake used the time to study the creature more carefully. Now that he was close enough to see it clearly without barriers in the way, he could appreciate just how well designed it was as a predator. Its muscles were lean and efficient, built for quick bursts of speed rather than sustained effort. Its multiple eyes gave it an incredible field of vision, and Jake could see that they moved independently to track different areas of the room. What impressed him most was the creature's intelligence. The shadow stalker wasn't just waiting for an opportunity to attack. It was learning. Jake could see it analyzing his posture, his movements, even his breathing patterns. The creature was trying to understand what kind of threat he represented and how serious he was about defending his territory. Professor Veltar had managed to calm down enough to work on his damaged equipment. The old reptilian was attempting to restore power to the emergency communication system, muttering to himself as he tried different combinations of switches and buttons. His hand still shook, but he was no longer in complete panic. Mirlin had recovered enough to sit up properly in her chair. The aquatic being's pale blue skin had returned to its normal color, and her gills were working steadily instead of the rapid fluttering that indicated fear. She was watching Jake with an expression of amazement that her species used when encountering something completely outside their experience. Zixtal was the most improved of Jake's three friends. The Vorthan's crystalline body had healed most of its stress fractures, and rainbow colors were beginning to flow through his structure again. His people processed trauma by analyzing it intellectually, and Jake could almost see him trying to understand what he was witnessing. Quindar was slowly coming out of his shock-induced trance. The insectoid's compound eyes were tracking movement, again, and his forearms had begun making small unconscious gestures. Without his hive-mind connection, recovery was slower for him than it would have been for the others. But he was definitely becoming aware of his surroundings again. The emergency door at the back of the classroom suddenly hissed open, and 2 Academy security officers rushed in. They were both wearing full protective gear and carrying energy weapons designed for dealing with dangerous creatures. Jake recognized them as members of the Centauri species, tall and thin with gray skin, and large eyes adapted for low-light conditions. "Nobody move," the first officer commanded as he took in the scene. His weapon was already trained on the Shadow Stalker, which had noticed the new arrivals and shifted into a more defensive posture. Jake held up one hand slowly, making sure not to make any sudden movements. "Wait," he said calmly. "The situation is under control." The second security officer looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "Student, step away from the predator immediately. We will handle this." But Jake could see that the Shadow Stalker was becoming agitated by the presence of the armed officers. The creature's 6 eyes were darting between Jake and the newcomers, and its muscles were tensing in preparation for either fight or flight. The careful balance Jake had established was about to be destroyed. "Please don't shoot," Jake said still, keeping his voice calm and steady. "The creature isn't being aggressive. If you threaten it, you'll force it to attack." The first officer's finger moved to his weapon's trigger. "Move aside, human. That is a Class 5 predator. Protocol requires immediate neutralization." Jake realized he had to make a choice. He could step aside and let the security officers handle the situation their way, which would probably result in the Shadow Stalker being killed. Or he could trust his instincts and try to resolve the confrontation peacefully. He chose to trust his instincts. Instead of moving away from the Shadow Stalker, Jake began walking slowly toward it. The creature's attention immediately focused back on him, and he could see confusion in its multiple eyes. The security officers behind him were shouting orders for him to stop, but Jake ignored them. "Easy," he said softly to the Shadow Stalker, using the same gentle tone he had used before. "I know you're scared. All these new people with weapons are making you nervous. But you don't need to fight. I'm going to help you get out of here safely." The Shadow Stalker tilted its head, clearly puzzled by Jake's approach. Most creatures would either attack or flee when faced with armed enemies. Jake was doing neither. Instead, he was positioning himself between the predator and the security officers, using his body as a shield. "Jake, what are you doing?" Professor Veltar called out, his voice filled with terror. "Those officers are here to help us." But Jake could see that the Shadow Stalker was beginning to understand his intentions. The creature's body language was changing from defensive aggression to cautious trust. It was recognizing that Jake was protecting it rather than threatening it. Jake continued his slow approach until he was within arm's reach of the Shadow Stalker. The creature could have killed him easily at that distance, but instead, it simply watched him with intelligent curiosity. Jake reached out slowly and gently touched the wall near the creature's head, not touching the Shadow Stalker itself, but showing that he wasn't afraid of it. "There's an emergency exit behind you," Jake said quietly, gesturing toward a panel in the wall that he had noticed earlier. "If I can get it open, you can leave through there. Would you like that?" The Shadow Stalker's primary eyes followed his, gestured to the emergency panel. The creature seemed to understand that Jake was offering it an escape route. After a moment of consideration, it moved slightly to the side, giving Jake access to the panel while keeping its attention on the armed security officers. Jake pressed the emergency release button, and the panel slid open to reveal a maintenance corridor that led to the outside of the building. Fresh air flowed into the classroom, carrying scents from the academy's gardens. The shadow stalker immediately perked up at the smell of the outdoors. Its 6 eyes turned toward the opening, and Jake could see longing in its expression. The creature wanted to be outside, away from the confined spaces and artificial lights of the academy. "Go ahead," Jake said softly. "You can leave now. Nobody will hurt you." The shadow stalker looked at Jake one more time, and Jake could swear he saw something like gratitude in its alien eyes. Then the creature bounded through the emergency exit in a single graceful leap and disappeared into the corridor beyond. The security officers immediately rushed to the opening, but Jake blocked their way. "Let it go," he said firmly. "It's not a threat anymore. It just wants to get back to its natural habitat." The first officer lowered his weapon reluctantly. That creature could be dangerous to other students. It was only dangerous because it was trapped and scared, Jake explained. Now that it's free, it will probably try to find a way off this planet and back to its home world. Shadow stalkers are intelligent enough to avoid unnecessary conflicts. Professor Veltar approached slowly, still shaking from his ordeal. "Jake, how did you know what to do? Our training never covered anything like this situation." Jake shrugged. "Where I come from, we deal with predators all the time. You just have to understand that they're not evil or malicious. They're just animals trying to survive. If you treat them with respect and don't corner them, most of them would rather avoid fighting." Mirlin spoke up from her chair, her voice filled with wonder. "On my world, we have never had to face creatures like that. Our oceans have large predators, but they hunt in the deep waters where we rarely encounter them. I cannot imagine living somewhere that you must learn to deal with such dangerous animals as children." Zixtal's crystalline structure was now showing full rainbow colors again, indicating that he had recovered from his trauma and was thinking clearly. "Jake, you mentioned that Earth has many creatures more dangerous than the shadow stalker. How is this possible? How does your species survive?" Jake sat down in his chair, suddenly feeling tired now that the crisis was over. "We survive because we learn to adapt. Earth is what you call a death world, I guess. Everything there is trying to kill something else. But that doesn't make it a bad place to live. It just means we had to get really good at understanding predators, reading animal behavior and knowing when to fight and when to back down." Quindar had fully recovered from his shock and was listening intently. "But how do you learn such things?" "On my world, the hive mind shares all knowledge instantly. If one of us learns something new, we all know it immediately. We learn by experience," Jake explained. "My grandfather taught me about animals when I was young. He learned from his grandfather, who learned from his grandfather before that. Each generation passes down what they know about surviving on our world." Professor Veltar had been listening to this conversation with growing amazement. "Jake, would you be willing to share this knowledge with our xenobiology department? What you did today was extraordinary. You resolved a crisis that could have resulted in multiple casualties, and you did it without violence or advanced technology.